Hello, namaskar. Welcome to IDP Ielts Live, and I am your Ielts expert for today. My name is Andrew Steele, and I've been working with Ielts for a very long time. So let's get straight into the topic of today's live cast, which is how to get the band score that you want in Ielts at your first attempt. It's good to get it at your first attempt. It'll boost your confidence and save you some money. So I think that there are 3 questions that you need to ask yourself in order to really make sure that you get that band score you want the first time you take the test. The first question you need to ask yourself is, what is my current level of English? That's question number 1. Question number 2, what IELTS band score do I need to get? Now this is going to depend on what you need IELTS for. Do you need it for a university? If so, is it an undergraduate degree or a postgraduate degree? Do you need it to immigrate? Do you need it to start a job? It's going to be different, so make sure you find out what IELTS band score you need, and then you can answer that second all-important question. What IELTS band score do I need to get? The third question that you need to ask yourself, and please be realistic, is how long is it going to take me to get from A to B? And if you get that timing right, and you do your preparation right, you should get the band score you need on your first attempt. So, let's look at 3 different scenarios. Perhaps your English is already at the right level to get the band score you want, and you just need to understand the test. In which case, you'll need to do some test technique preparation, which I'll talk about a bit more in a moment. Or, second scenario, perhaps your English is close to the right level, the level that you need, but you need to develop one or more of your skills a bit further. For example, reading or writing, or a sub-skill like grammar or vocabulary. That's a second scenario. The third scenario is that maybe your current band score is around about a 5.5 and you need to bring that up to a 7. So 3 possible scenarios. You need to decide, based on your scenario, how much time you need to spend developing language skills and how much time you need to spend developing test technique. In that first example, someone whose English is already at the right level to get the band score they want, then it's very much a focus on test technique, understanding the different tests, reading, writing, speaking and listening, and understanding the different question types. If, however, you need to spend some time developing your reading skills or improving your grammar or vocabulary, you're going to need to spend a bit longer. I would say, on average, it takes about 20 to 30 hours to focus only on test technique and test skills, but maybe an additional 10 to 20 hours if you want to further develop a particular skill or sub-skill. So already, if you're looking at, okay, I need to learn the test technique, and I also want to improve my writing because I know that's not very good, you're already looking at about 50 hours. So do be realistic about this. Otherwise, you'll just end up taking that IELTS test again and again and again because you didn't get the band score that you want. Now, the third scenario is the scenario where you're a couple of band scores below what you want to be. Don't fool yourself. There are no quick fixes for this. If there was a sudden quick fix, IELTS wouldn't be so widely accepted for immigration by the governments of Australia, New Zealand, the UK and Canada. Of course it wouldn't, yeah? So if you're a long way away from the Ielts band score you need to do something first. You need to improve your language skills. Take a language course, online, face-to-face, learn some vocabulary, learn those grammar rules, do lots of work, and then do an Ielts test preparation course to learn all about exam technique. So, just to recap on that and to summarise then, there are two sets of skills you may need to develop in order to get the Ielts band score you want first time. These are language skills, which include things like vocabulary, grammar, being able to paraphrase, being coherent, easy to understand, cohesive devices linking what you say together, fluency, pronunciation, and fewer errors. Those are all language skills. The other set of skills that you will need to develop for the Ielts test are test skills. And this is all about understanding different task types, understanding the assessment criteria, particularly for the writing and the speaking tests, coming up with different strategies that you can use on test day for each of those different task types, study skills, time management, things like this. So, be aware. Where are you now? Where do you need to be? And how long is it going to take you to get there? Be realistic and make sure you strike a balance of developing your test skills and your language skills, depending on your individual needs. Now, if you do that, you should be able to get the band score that you want first time. Let's move on to have a look at a few tips for the 4 different parts of the Ielts test. And then I can see a few questions are coming in here, so we'll take a few questions before we finish. So let's begin then with the listening test. One very good tip for the listening test is to listen to a broad range of accents. Don't forget, you might hear a British accent, an American accent, a Canadian accent, an Australian accent, a New Zealand accent. These days, you might even hear an Indian accent. In Ielts listening tests today, we hear many non-native speakers of English in a university or college scenario, for example. So listen to a range of accents. You can find this range of accents by listening to the BBC, CNN, Radio Australia, Radio New Zealand, CBC Radio Calendar, all of these, in addition to TED Talks, YouTube. Scour the internet for a range of accents and make sure you're comfortable listening to all of them. This will also be useful for your speaking test because your speaking examiner could have any sort of native speaker accent. So that's the first good tip for the listening test. In terms of the skills that you need to answer the different question types, one skill that goes across the board is answer prediction. Get into the habit of being able to look at a question and then think about what sort of answer should go in there. Is it a number? Is it a name? Is it an address? Is it a noun, an adjective? So that's something that you can train yourselves to do by looking at past test papers. Not necessarily listening to the recording, but looking at those questions and predicting what sort of information is going to be featured in the answer. Also in the listening, keywords are very important. In fact, keywords are very important in every part of the Ielts test. Practice looking at keywords in questions and then very quickly thinking about possible synonyms for those keywords. Vocabulary, synonyms, antonyms are crucial for a high band score in the Ielts test. Now then, let's move on to the reading. And again, as we said, for the listening, you should listen to a wide range of accents. For the reading test, you need to practice reading from a wide range of sources and maybe noting down any unknown vocabulary and making notes about the collocation and the synonyms and antonyms and the pronunciation, etc. of those new words. I would recommend websites such as perhaps The Guardian, The Atlantic, National Geographic, Al Jazeera, anywhere where you can find fairly high quality journalism. Texts that are similar to those that you might find in the IELTS reading test. And don't forget, as with the listening test, the more vocabulary that you have, the easier you're going to find the reading test to do. There are also a few basic reading skills that you really need to develop for every question type in that IELTS reading test. The first is skimming and scanning. Skimming simply means being able to read a text very quickly to get the gist, knowing what it's about. And you want to aim for really quickly looking at a reading text, maybe for 10 seconds and saying, yes, I know what this is all about, because your skim reading skills are good. Scanning is all about finding specific information. And this is where your synonyms and your antonyms are going to help. If you've been able to identify a key word in the question, then you should be able to identify synonyms and antonyms or similar words in the text. This will help you to find the place in the text where you can read more closely for the correct answer. Let's move on to a couple of tips for the writing test. First of all, be aware of the assessment criteria. Task achievement or task response, coherence and cohesion, vocabulary and grammar. This is what the examiner is looking for. And be aware of the specific assessment criteria for the band score that you want to get. Have a look at Ielts.org and you'll find public versions of the band descriptors, which are pretty similar to the band descriptors that the examiners use. Task achievement or task response in writing task 2 is all about how well you've answered the question. Now in task 1, there are some particular criteria that you need to fulfill and a finite number of possibilities that you could put in terms of your answer. So make sure that you know what those criteria are. In writing task 2, it's more open-ended, but you still need to make sure that you cover all parts of the question and that you stay on topic in order to get a good score for task response. So practice doing that. Have a look at some writing task 2 questions. Go through them and identify what's the topic and what's the task. You need to be able to do that quickly and accurately to get a good score in the IELTS writing test, part 2, task 2. Coherence and cohesion then. This is all about the flow of your writing, how easy it is to read. Does it progress nicely? Does it have a beginning and a middle and an end? That's the coherence aspect. The cohesion aspect is how many cohesive devices you use. Cohesive devices? What is a cohesive device? Well, it's a linking word, or a connector, or a referencing word. Pronouns, for example. In the first sentence, I might say Andrew, but in the second sentence, I might say he. That's an example of referencing. Also, consider your grammar and vocabulary. Do you need to expand either? Don't forget that in the writing test, you're judged on the range of vocabulary and grammar you use and how accurately you use that vocabulary and grammar. So make sure that you have a look at those band descriptors, that you understand what's required at each level, and that you develop your skills to make sure that you are able to use those different criteria at the level required for the band score that you want. Finally then, before we take some questions, let's move on to the speaking test. Now in the speaking test, you also need to understand the assessment criteria. And this time, they're fluency and coherence, vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. Again, these are available on Ielts.org in a public version, which is very similar to the one that IELTS speaking examiners use. Understand the format. First of all, you're going to be asked about some common everyday topics. Then you'll be asked to do a long turn, to speak for 1 or 2 minutes on a specific topic. And finally, you'll engage in a more abstract discussion with the examiner. So make sure you understand the format, make sure you know what to expect in each section. Don't think about the content of what you're saying too much. Don't worry about that. Focus on speaking. Although you're judged on vocabulary, you're not really judged on your ideas or the nitty-gritty of the content of what you say. You're tested on your use of the English language. You're not tested on your knowledge or your intelligence. Don't worry if you don't really know much about a topic. Talk about what you don't know. Talk about what you'd like to know. Talk about why you don't know about that topic. The important thing is to say as much as possible. The larger the sample of language that you provide to the examiner, the more they'll be able to bump up your score, especially in part 3, which in my opinion is the most important part of the speaking test. Even if you don't do so well because you were maybe a bit nervous in parts 1 and 2, you can bring it all back in part 3 if you give a solid performance and get the band score that you want. Another tip for the speaking test is to record yourself. Analyse your performance. How often did you repeat a word or phrase? Try to eliminate that. Did you pause or hesitate too much? If so, try to eliminate that also. Was your voice a bit monotone with not much upward or downward movement so that it sounded quite boring? Obviously, that doesn't sound good. Your pronunciation score might dip if you did something like that. So do be aware of your intonation and the movement in your voice. It is something that examiners assess. And finally, in terms of your speaking, do you need to focus more on fluency, being able to keep going, or on accuracy, using the right words, grammar, and expressions? Or perhaps you need to focus on both. In any case, reflect on your performance by recording a video of yourself, answering some questions from the speaking test, or an audio recording. Okay, so we've had a look then at some tips for getting the band score that you want first time. Make sure that you understand what you need to do. Where am I now? Where do I want to be? How long is it going to take to get there? Make sure that you understand the test format, what's required of you in each of the tests, and all of those different question types. And then have a strategy for each of those question types. How are you going to approach it? On test day, when the writing test starts, what are you going to do first? What are you going to do second? What are you going to do third? The clearer your strategy is for each question type and each test in your mind, the more relaxed you'll be and the better you'll perform. And now I can see that we've got some questions coming in on the screen. So we've got time for a few. Let's see how many we can get through. First of all, we have one from Geeta, who is in Bangalore. And Geeta says, how is the IELTS score calculated and what is the passing score? Well, thank you for that question, Geeta. So, the score is calculated by taking a band score for the reading, a band score for the writing, band score for the listening, and a band score for the speaking, and adding them all together and dividing by 4. Now, I'm sure Cambridge Assessment has an algorithm for it. This is top secret information, so we don't really know how it works. But a simple explanation is that those 4 scores are taken, added together, divided by 4, and that gives you the overall band score. Geeta also asks about a passing score. There is no pass or fail. It's a test, not an exam. You will be scored on a scale of 1 to 9. 9 being equivalent language level of an educated native speaker, 1 being a non-user of the language. Now, the score you need, as I said a little bit earlier, is very much going to depend on what you are taking the IELTS test for. You may be taking it to join a postgraduate program at a university, in which case you may be required to get a 7 or above. Or you may be joining a pathway or foundation undergraduate program at a university, in which case you may need something like a 5.5. You may be using it for immigration. You'll need a different score. You may be using it to join a professional society. You'll need a different score. So the advice is find out what band score you need for what you want to do with the IELTS test. And don't forget, IELTS opens up opportunities, so you could do lots of different things with it. Find out what the organisation or institution you're applying to requires. That's the band score you need. There's no pass or fail. Okay, we've got another question here from Ajay in Delhi. Thank you for sending in a question to IDP Live, Ajay. What resources do we recommend for IELTS preparation? Well, very simply, I mean, there's lots of stuff out there. If you're looking at IELTS websites which are not connected to IDP, not connected to Cambridge Assessment, then do look at them with a critical eye. They may be good, but they might not. So look at them with a critical eye. What you can guarantee is going to be top quality with accurate information. Good strategies for you are 1, IELTS.org. That's IELTS.org. Lots of useful resources for test takers there. And of course, IELTS.idp.com/prepare. Lots of fabulous resources there. So my advice would be, have a look around, but, be sure that you're using reliable preparation resources. Don't just use any old website. You may get poor advice. There are so many IELTS websites out there. Look at them with a critical eye. Okay, moving on then. We've got one from Raza in Hyderabad here. Thank you, Raza, for sending in this question to IDP IELTS Live. Are there any specific strategies for the multiple choice questions in the reading test? Well, what I generally advise my students when I'm teaching IELTS is to do this. First of all, have a look at I'm talking about there are lots of multiple choice type questions in IELTS. Let's talk about the ones where you've got a question and then there's 4 possible answers, A, B, C, or D. That type of multiple choice question. So what I generally advise my students to do is to first of all have a look at the question itself and then underline the key words in the question. Don't look at those 4 options. You will confuse yourself. Look at them a bit later. So only look at the question, underline the key words, and then start thinking about any possible synonyms or paraphrases that might appear in the reading text for the key words that you've identified in the question. Then scan, find those key words in the reading text and see if you can answer the question without looking at the 4 options. So when you come to the 4 options, you want to have in your mind a good idea of what the answer could be. Usually, you'll be able to do this. So then, it's just a question of going through each of the options, either to confirm that it's a correct answer, or similarly, to confirm that it's a wrong answer. And you should look quickly at all 4 of the options, going back to the text as necessary to confirm or deny your ideas. So that's a good strategy for multiple choice questions in the reading test. And the important thing is try to answer the question first before looking at the 4 options. If you look at the 4 options and then start reading the text, you will completely forget what those 4 options are because it's far too much to hold in your short-term memory. Okay, so next question then is from Harvinder in Bathinda. That rhymes. Thank you, Harvinder in Bathinda, for that question. Are there any common themes or topics that come up in the writing and speaking sections of the IELTS test? Well, yes, there are, but they're quite general, but good areas or themes to learn some vocabulary, grammar, expressions, functions about would be perhaps the environment, the media, entertainment, sport, modern life, maybe in cities, science and technology, work, education, health. These types of very general topics come up again and again and again. So these are the sort of areas that you should look at in terms of expanding your vocabulary. Time for 1 or 2 more questions and then we'll end today's live broadcast. Bijoy from Kolkata asks, what are some common grammar mistakes made by non-native English speakers? Well, I can't really answer that. We don't have the time because different non-native speakers make different mistakes. For example, speakers of Bengali are going to make different mistakes from speakers of Hindi. Speakers of Hindi are going to make different mistakes from speakers of French, etc., etc. So it very much depends on what your native language is, your mother tongue, as to what type of mistakes that you're going to be making in English. I'll highlight one that I have noticed a lot in my experience in India, and that is an overuse of the present continuous. So using ing forms rather too often. So saying things like, I am having a big car rather than I have a big car. Don't forget that in English, if we're describing a state, something that remains true for a long time, like have a car, you might have a car for years, so it's remaining true for a long time, then we tend not to use the ing form of the verb. We tend to use the simple form of the verb. So that's one mistake that you might be making with your English grammar. Another one that's very common is subject-verb agreement. So things like he don't have instead of he doesn't have. That might be something to look at. And another very small thing, but very complex, and I would advise anyone taking IELTS to revise this, is the use of articles. A, an, the, or no article at all. That's a very complex area of English grammar, and certainly one that if you use it accurately could push your grammar score up. Okay, last question then. And this one comes from Mingma in Darjeeling. Hello Mingma, thank you for sending in this question. And Mingma says, how can I use technology to improve my language skills? Well, don't forget, the internet is a great resource for listening and for reading. You know, the more you can read, the more you can listen to different accents. Some of those sites I mentioned earlier in this broadcast are great for that. And another thing, the risk of repeating myself, is use your phone, record yourself speaking, and then assess yourself. So I think, the internet and the use of recordings. Record your classmates, assess them. All sorts of things you can do with a mobile phone in order to reflect on your performance. So, thank you very much for spending time with me, Andrew Steele, and with IDP IELTS here today. This has been IDP IELTS Live. I have been the IELTS expert, and we'll see you next time. So, bye, namaskar. Bye-bye.